Hi, I'm James from Chaosium. I sat down with Lynne and we talked about travel in tabletop role-playing games. Depending on the setting and the system, travel can be a very minor part of a game, or it can be really, really important. In this interview, Lynne shares her perspective on travel in tabletop role-playing games more broadly, but also more specifically on Call of Cthulhu, and even more specifically on Children of Fear, which is a Call of Cthulhu mega campaign that Lynne wrote. I'm going to jump across to that interview in just a moment, but first, remember to subscribe to our YouTube channel. It helps us out and it lets us make more content like this. Thanks.
Right, so the role of travel in role-playing games. Well, I mean, it can have two roles, can't it? It can literally be the whole Indiana Jones redlining. So you have your map. It's just something that happens in the background because your investigators need to get from A to B, and there's nothing interesting on the way, or it's not a fundamental integral part of the story. The other use of travel is that you can use it to introduce elements of the scenario, perhaps the broader themes. You can use it to introduce clues and hints or useful NPCs that the players and the investigators might want to refer to later. And both of those are equally valid ways of doing it. The main thing is to make sure that travel isn't a slog and it's not just slowing down the whole story.
I can completely see how that's a major thing that you need to balance. Do you think that there are situations in which travel is the most important part of a tabletop role-playing game?
Oh, I suppose, are you trying to get me to say that it's the friends we make along the way rather than the journey?
That'd be clever. No, I was kind of thinking about games like The One Ring, for example, or where travel could fit as more of the central focus for a tabletop role-playing game as opposed to some other focuses.
Yes, but again, it all depends on the type of story you want to tell. If the travel is the important thing, then you have to make it central and you have to make it part of the story. I mean, okay, aside from all the descriptions of trees in Tolkien's work, the journey is the important thing in The Lord of the Rings, as it is in The Hobbit, as much as anything else that's going on around it. So if you want the journey to be integral, you have to make it interesting. You have to make sure that there are lots of things that are happening on that journey to keep the players invested and to keep their investigators invested as well and keep them busy and occupied. Because we know what investigators are like if you don't keep them busy. You know, the devil makes work for idle hands and all that. So, but if that journey isn't the point of the story you're trying to tell, don't force it, don't dwell on it, get it done and out of the way as quickly as possible, because that's not your focus, that's not the important bit.
Let me segue across to your work and to Call of Cthulhu in general. I can hear that the focus of travel should always be something that is based on the type of story that you want to tell and not determined by the game that you're playing or the setting that you're creating. But more broadly in Call of Cthulhu, do you think that the themes and the structure of the game lean themselves towards a travel-centric story?
Again, it really does depend on the story and how you want to use it. Masks of Nyarlathotep has an absolute ton of travel in it. But unless you want something to happen on that boat from New York to London, you gloss over it, you redline it. You get on the boat in New York, you get off in England. That's fine. You know, when you're going from London to Egypt, if you want to, you could have all sorts of adventures in between there of the GM's own creation. But it's not essential to the story unless you've come up with a really cool idea to put in clues and bring in NPCs that somehow the investigators have missed. But then again, you've got Call of Cthulhu scenarios, which are absolutely fantastic, that don't go anywhere other than a very small locale. You're literally in a house, like the scenarios in Mansions of Madness. Most of them, once you're on that site, that's it. That's the thing. So travel isn't essential to Call of Cthulhu scenarios, but it can be a really fun and entertaining part of them.
So talking about some more of your work, more specifically Children of Fear, which features an enormous journey as the basis for the campaign. When you were writing Children of Fear or coming up with the idea for Children of Fear, was travel always going to be a central part of it, or was that just incidental?
It was always going to be part of it, but it wasn't until really that I started doing the research that it became apparent how much of a part of it was going to be. There were certain areas that I wanted to have scenes, scenarios take place in as part of the campaign. And of course, they're quite far spread. You've got Tibet, you've got Central Asia, you've got Northern India. So you've got to travel between them. You're traveling at a time when means of transport in that part of the world are reasonably limited. Obviously, there are cars. There is a massive race from Peking to Paris that goes through some of this in the 1920s. But that's not necessarily the most accessible or easy way of traveling. You're talking foot, cart, horses, particularly when you're going over huge mountain ranges. So, but it was one of these things where it was going to be incidental. But then the more research I did, I started realizing that the areas that I'd picked were very, very much following the route that Xuanzang took for Journey to the West, which is what those of us of a certain age know best by the television series Monkey. And younger generation people will know from Dragon Ball Z. The original Dragon Ball Z is pretty much Journey to the West, retold in anime form. And at that point, it kind of became, well, what can we find along the route to make the journey more interesting? And because of where it's set, there are lots of strange ghost stories and stories of disappearances and other interesting and weird things going in that you can bring into the journey to have as scenes along the way. So while the journey still isn't necessarily the most important part of the story, you can bring it in and you can have interesting things happen along it so that it's not just, oh, well, you slog for several thousand miles and then you're there.
There was an editing hiccup and I lost the next question I asked Lynne. I'm filming this pickup later. Can you tell that the shelves behind me have changed? Anyway, the question that I asked Lynne was, how do you know whether you should be emphasizing travel for your group or not?
As a keeper, you need to look at what your players enjoy. Some players enjoy that travel, the scenery, the opportunity it gives them to build character, to interact with NPCs, get themselves into no end of trouble. Other groups don't like that. They want to get on with the core story. They want to be in there and at it and solving the problems that are directly key to that story. So it's one of these, if you don't know what your group likes, suck it and see. Give them a little bit of an experience of that travel to gauge how they want to do it. If they want to have the details of finding places to stay, paying for a roadside inn, dealing with all the horrible things that live in the bedclothes and what have you from the several thousand other people that have been on that route over the decades, centuries, millennia before you, um, you know, but if you know that your group don't enjoy that sort of thing, don't put them through it. Redlining was created for Pulp Cthulhu for a reason, partly to reflect the whole Indiana Jones aesthetic of that's not what's important for this story, but also so that you don't have to make them do something that they don't enjoy. At the end of the day, I know we've said it a lot, this game is about enjoying yourself and having fun. And being made to grind through a several thousand-mile trek is pretty much how I always used to view cross-country runs at school. You kind of have to get through it, but it certainly isn't fun.
So when you have decided to include travel in your games because you think your group is going to enjoy it, what steps can you take to make sure that the travel you present is the most exciting and the most engaging for your players?
Give them things to do. Don't just have it as like a travelogue, like a documentary film that they're watching. Give them things to get involved in, decisions to make. If they see something interesting, they want to go off and explore it, let them do that. Move clues so that if they decide to head off in completely the opposite direction to the one you thought, you've got something there for them to find and interact with. They're probably going to be traveling with a caravan unless they're really bold and dozy. So there's going to be people they can talk to. Use those people to give them clues if you need to. Use them to foreshadow elements of the plot. If you're do a little bit of background reading on the region that they're traveling through. See if there's anything that jumps out to you that you think that you could use to enrich that journey. And there's certainly with conversations I had with various people at Chaosium Con, there were huge really interesting areas of research and things that I'd completely missed. The where they'd created extra encounters along the way that, they used to support the story, to reinforce the themes of the story, that really enriched that travel time and that journey.
At the risk of asking a relatively simple follow-on question, what's the mistakes you can make? How do you stuff up travel, and what should you never do when you're trying to make it fun for your players?
Just, just do the same thing over and over again, or hit them with the same thing too many times. When you're reading a lot of the stories about Central Asia and Tibet in the 1920s, it's bandit attacks every 30 seconds. But that is going to get so boring so quickly if it's sort of like, oh, day 2 of the journey, you get attacked by bandits. Day 3 of the journey, oh, look, you get attacked by a slightly different set of bandits who steal all your stuff and your food, and you have to go and find new things. So it's basically about keeping it varied and not leaning too heavily on certain elements. And that is something that I mentioned in Children of Fear. There were an awful lot of bandit attacks, but that doesn't mean that everything that your investigators come up against has to be a bandit attack, because, yeah, that's going to get really stale very, very quickly and incredibly frustrating for your players if they keep losing all their gear and then have to go off on a little side quest to get new things.
I'd like to know if you think it's okay to start a campaign or an adventure with a particular level of focus on travel and then to gradually lower that as the game goes through. Do you think that that kind of experience removes the players from the action, or do you think it just smooths the gameplay line further down?
Yeah, it can certainly smooth the gameplay line further down. But again, that's something I would say, look at how your players enjoy that. If you don't know how your players are going to react to travel, starting with that travel and then seeing whether you need to ramp it down and smooth it as the story gathers momentum and the travel becomes less important, because you know what you're doing now, you know what your focus is, what your goal is, and you want to get to that as quickly as possible. That's a perfectly valid thing to do. But again, if your players are still enjoying that journey, don't feel that you have to do that.
I have two final questions for you because I know we've dived into this pretty deeply. The first is a Children of Fear specific question. When you are traveling across Central Asia and you have all of these different options that are going to be presented to your players, whether they want to take northern routes or southern routes or go in one direction or another, do you have any tips about how to make the choice between the different directions that players take really matter when they don't necessarily fully understand the consequences of the decisions that they're making at that point?
Oh, that's a good one. Um, in the playtest I did with one of the groups, they literally tossed a coin to see which direction they were going in, but that fitted their group, and it made sense for their group to do that. There is absolutely nothing wrong with the keeper going, look, you have a choice. In character, you might not know what the consequences of that choice are going to be, but as players, would you prefer this route which touches on X, or would you prefer to go this route which has elements of Y in it? And then you can work that into how their investigators go about choosing it. Perhaps someone could give them advice to say, well, you really probably should think about route X because it's a bit safer this time of year, or you really should think about route Y because there are far more Western contacts along that route, or, there's a lot more villages and oases along that route. So if you do get into trouble, there's less of a risk, kind of thing. So yeah, there's absolutely nothing wrong with stepping to one side and finding out what your players would enjoy, and then going back into the story with their investigators.
So my last question, following on that a little bit, and it contains more direct spoilers for Children of Fear. So I'll give a quick warning to everybody to skip over this question if they don't want it. And that question concerns Tenzin specifically and how he fits into the travel largely. You've given an option in the campaign for Tenzin to step away and to take a different route than the characters. If you have Tenzin inside your group, how important do you think he is to the travel? Do you think people should be thinking about where he fits into a car or what supplies he has, do you really need to chart him very carefully, or can he just sort of be an incidental character that follows along and it's assumed he'll take care of himself?
Given who he is and what he is, he's pretty good at taking care of himself and existing for long periods of time without having a huge amount of sustenance, and he's used to traveling huge distances. So I would treat him primarily as an incidental character. He's not there to overshadow the investigators. He's there as a subtle guide to the investigators. He will chip in to help them if he feels that they need it, but he's not really somebody that they want to worry about. He's there, he's enjoying the journey because the journey for him is spiritual. It's part of his journey towards his ultimate goal to facilitate them in what they're doing. So, you know, he's not the focus. One of the reasons the option was given for him to go off and do his own thing was so that players didn't come to rely on him to get them out of all sorts of problems if they got themselves into them. Of course, his viewpoint is that this is a test for them. This is for them. This whole journey is for them to prove that they are worthy of the task that they have been apparently chosen for. So if he steps in and does everything for them, then that's not them proving themselves. That's not them showing that they are indeed the people who need to be doing this task. But yeah, we wanted to make sure that people had options, that if they didn't want to have that sort of like really powerful character there who could potentially overshadow the investigators, or who the investigators could come to rely on far too much, then you can get him out of the way and you can meet up with him later when it does become plot critical.
Is there any final details you want to add? Maybe thoughts or reflections that I didn't think to ask you that you want to mention about travel?
I mean, it's just going back to that whole point that we mentioned before. If your players enjoy it, do it. If your players don't enjoy it, redline it. If they like a little bit of a mix, try and see if you can work out where that balance is. Because travel can be fun and interesting in the real world. It can also be dull and just has to be something that you get through, like airline travel. Let's face it, I hate flying, but it's something I have to do. So I grit my teeth and I get through it. Whereas, you know, train journeys I quite like because I can look out of the window. They don't make me travel sick. Car journeys I quite like because I get to see the pretty scenery because they also don't make me travel sick. You know, so it's making travel suitable and serve the purpose that you need it to and that you and your players will enjoy.